The stars above the silent world flickered like distant candles, cold and uncaring. The abandoned planet lay in ruin, its cities cracked and crumbling, its oceans stained with the gray of ash. Once, this had been a thriving alien homeworld, a place filled with music, laughter, and light. But when the war came, no one answered their calls for help. Not the Galactic Council. Not their so-called allies. The galaxy watched from a safe distance as the weak fell. The Veskari, a gentle and fragile race, were known for their healing arts and their songs that calmed storms. But in a universe where power decided worth, their kindness meant nothing. Their desperate transmissions echoed unanswered through the void, fading like whispers in a hurricane. And then, when all hope was gone, when their last cities were burning, something stirred in the darkness. A single Terran fleet changed course. When the human ships arrived, the Veskari didn't believe it at first. No one came to help the helpless. The galaxy was too afraid of the enemy that had invaded, a war-hungry species that saw weaker civilizations as resources. Yet, from the black of space, sleek human warships emerged, engines burning like silent suns. Their arrival broke the static silence that had blanketed the planet for months. Across the crumbling city towers, the few remaining Veskari looked up at the sky as streaks of light fell toward their world. No one knew why the humans had come. No one believed they would fight. But when the first Terran soldiers stepped through the smoke, they didn't speak of politics. They raised their weapons toward the invaders and made a promise with their actions. They were not going to let this world fall. The invaders had expected no resistance. The Council had made it clear, this war wasn't theirs to fight. The Veskari weren't worth saving. Their resources were low. Their fleets were weak. They were, in the cold calculation of galactic politics, expendable. But humanity didn't calculate like that. They didn't pick wars by the size of profit. They picked wars when someone needed to be protected. And when the first human fleet cut through the invader lines like a blade through fog, the galaxy finally turned its gaze back to the forgotten world. Terran railguns lit the sky with burning silver streaks, and the night trembled under the roar of ships that did not retreat. The invaders, shocked and furious, threw everything they had at the humans. But humanity had faced worse. Down in the streets, the Veskari huddled in underground shelters, their long fingers holding each other as the earth shook. They expected to hear the screams of the dying, the sound of another civilization crushed beneath a boot. Instead, they heard the thunder of human drop ships breaking through the clouds, the deep rhythmic steps of Terran soldiers moving with the weight of centuries of war behind them. They were not saviors in shining armor. They were tired, scarred, and fierce. But they were here. And for a race that had been abandoned, that was enough. As the war raged in orbit, word of the Terran intervention reached the Galactic Council. In their grand chamber of glass and gold, alien delegates argued among themselves. Some feared what humanity was doing, others whispered that this was reckless, that humans were interfering with council neutrality. But beneath their polished words, there was unease. Humanity had done something no one else dared. And the galaxy was watching. If the Terrans succeeded, it would expose the Council's cowardice. If they failed, it would prove humanity was as fragile as the rest. But humanity wasn't fighting for politics. They were fighting for people. And that made them dangerous in a way the Council had never understood. In the middle of the chaos, Captain Elias Vance stood on the bridge of the human flagship Iron Will, his hands gripping the railing as explosions bloomed like suns outside. He was a man who had seen too many wars, too many broken promises. But when he saw the Veskari transmissions, their children crying, their cities burning, he gave one order: turn the fleet around. Some of his officers argued. They had no treaty with the Veskari, no strategic value, no support from the Council. But Elias didn't need a treaty. He needed a reason. And the cries of the helpless were reason enough. The invaders soon realized their mistake. Humans didn't fight like the Council. They didn't calculate retreat when the numbers looked bad. They adapted. They bit back. And when pushed, they became something the galaxy feared but never admitted: predators with hearts that burned like stars. Terran ships moved through the black like wolves, cutting enemy formations into shards. Ground troops set ambushes in the ruins, striking fast and vanishing like ghosts. Every step the invaders took was met with resistance that only grew stronger. Humanity fought as if the world they were defending was their own. The Veskari, hidden in the shelters, heard human voices echo through the ruins. They didn't understand every word, but they understood the tone. Steady, firm, fearless. For the first time in months, their fear began to loosen its grip. They crawled out from the shadows to see Terran soldiers bleeding, laughing, fighting side by side. They saw the enemy pushed back inch by inch. And when one small Veskari child ran to a wounded human medic, the soldier simply smiled, lifted the child gently, and whispered, "You're safe now." Those words would spread through the entire race like a sunrise. As the days turned into nights, the war became a storm that swallowed the planet whole. The invaders poured more ships into orbit. The Council remained silent. Humanity dug in deeper. Captain Elias knew the fleet couldn't hold forever. The Terrans were outnumbered 10-1. But retreat wasn't in their vocabulary. Instead, he sent a single transmission across human space. His voice, calm but burning, said, "If we stand here, we stand for all of us. If they can wipe one people away while we look away, they'll do it again. And one day, it'll be us. So we fight." Human fleets answered. Colony ships, defense fleets, independent militias, all began to converge on the forgotten world. It wasn't about treaties anymore. It was about who humanity chose to be. And the galaxy, watching from a distance, began to whisper. If the Terrans won, it would change everything. If they lost, the Council would tighten its grip. But Elias didn't care about history. He cared about the people standing beside him. The final battle came at dawn. The invaders unleashed their entire armada, black ships blotting out the sun. The Terran fleet, battered and bruised, formed a shield around the planet. Every gun, every engine, every life pointed upward. The sky erupted into fire. Veskari children stood at broken windows and watched in awe as streaks of light crossed the heavens. On the ground, human soldiers dug into the rubble, their eyes locked on the advancing enemy columns. The fight that followed was brutal, loud, and unforgettable. But slowly, inch by inch, the invaders began to break. They had never faced a species that didn't run, that didn't give up, that didn't care about odds. When the last enemy ship burned up in the atmosphere, the world went silent. The humans stood in the ruins, armor cracked, faces covered in ash, but their flags still flew over the broken city. The Veskari emerged from their shelters and walked through the streets, staring at these strange, scarred creatures who had come when no one else did. One old Veskari healer approached Captain Elias, her hands trembling, and whispered, "Why? Why would you fight for us?" Elias simply looked at her and said, "Because someone had to." Word of the victory spread across the galaxy like fire in dry grass. Species that had long felt small and forgotten began to raise their heads again. If humanity could stand against the Council's fear and the invaders' strength, maybe they could too. The Galactic Council sat in uneasy silence, their power shaken. For centuries they had ruled through indifference and control. But now there was something stronger moving through the stars. Hope. And its name was humanity. From that day on, the Veskari told their children stories about the night the sky caught fire and the humans came. They told them about the strangers who fought for no reward, who bled for a world that wasn't their own, who showed them that even the weak are worth saving. And among the stars, humanity's legend grew. Not because they were perfect. Not because they were the strongest. But because when no one else came, they did. If you enjoyed this cinematic HFY sci-fi story about humanity, aliens, the Galactic Council, and a war that changed the galaxy, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. More stories of courage, war, and humanity's fire among the stars are coming soon. The smoke still rose from the shattered alien city long after the first battle ended, curling into the cold blue sky like the last breath of a dying world. Terran soldiers moved silently through the ruins, their boots crunching on broken glass and alien stone. The Veskari watched from doorways and collapsed walls, their thin bodies trembling from months of hunger and fear. They could not believe what they were seeing. For months, they had begged the Galactic Council for help, sending desperate messages into the void, hoping someone, anyone, would answer. No one did. Their allies abandoned them, trade partners blocked their channels, and the Council turned away with polite words and empty hands. And now, when they had accepted their death, the humans had come. No one understood why. Not even the humans themselves could fully explain it. They simply saw a people who were being erased, and decided that wasn't something they could stand by and watch. Inside the command center of the Terran flagship, Captain Elias Vance stared at the holographic map of the system. It was painted in blood-red enemy markers. The invaders controlled every major approach to the planet, their ships circling like vultures waiting for a meal to die. The Terran fleet was small, outnumbered and outgunned, but it was made of people who refused to back down. Officers gathered around the table, their uniforms still stained with ash and blood. The medics had worked all night pulling wounded soldiers out of collapsed buildings, and the engineers were still patching up scorched plating. No one complained. No one asked why they were here. They all knew the answer, and it wasn't strategy. It was something far simpler and far more dangerous. On the ground, Sergeant Nia Monroe led a small unit through the city's husk, checking for survivors. The Veskari had lived in harmony with their world for centuries, building tall, curved towers that sang with the wind. Now those towers were nothing but jagged skeletons scraping the sky. Nia's boots echoed against stone as she helped an old Veskari woman climb over the rubble. "You're safe," she said gently, her voice warm despite the smoke clogging the air. The woman stared up at her with wide, wet eyes, hands shaking as if she couldn't quite believe it. Humans were not angels. They were scarred, dirty, tired, and carrying rifles. But to the Veskari, they looked like salvation. Above them, enemy ships hovered at the edges of the atmosphere. The invaders were regrouping. Everyone on the Iron Will knew they would return. The Council would not intervene. No reinforcements were coming. This wasn't a strategic front the galaxy cared about. But Elias stood tall on the bridge and gave the order to hold the line anyway. He wasn't fighting for glory. He wasn't fighting for power. He was fighting because someone had to. News of the human arrival began to spread through the broken underground networks of the Veskari. Hiding in caves, basements, and crumbling subway systems, survivors whispered the same story over and over. The humans came. The humans are fighting. Children who hadn't smiled in months began to whisper the name Terran as though it was a spell that kept the dark away. And for the first time since the war began, they lifted their heads. Hope was dangerous, but it was powerful. That hope, however, came at a price. When the invaders returned, they came with fury. Their fleet expanded, their dropships darkened the skies, and their machines shook the ground like thunder. Humanity didn't retreat. Instead, the Terran fleet took position between the planet and the black wall of enemy ships. Every gun that could fire was aimed upward. In the streets, soldiers crouched behind rubble, their helmets flickering with targeting data, their fingers resting on triggers. The battle began not with words, but with light. Thousands of plasma bolts rained down like a storm, tearing through the upper atmosphere. Human ships answered with railguns that burned the sky with silver arcs. The Veskari huddled underground as the heavens roared above them. Explosions lit the night, and the black ships descended like a tide. The invaders expected the Terrans to break under their weight. They had crushed dozens of worlds this way. But what they didn't understand was that humans didn't break the same way others did. On the ground, Monroe's unit held the eastern approach to the city. Enemy mechs advanced through the ruins, their heavy legs pounding the earth. A Veskari medic, a young boy who had once studied healing, not war, watched in shock as humans moved with practiced ferocity. They didn't fight like defenders. They fought like predators. They slipped through the rubble, hit hard, and vanished into the smoke. For every human who fell, another stepped forward. The invaders, confident at first, started hesitating. And hesitation was something humans knew how to exploit. In orbit, the Iron Will took hit after hit. Shields flickered, plating cracked, and fire licked the control decks, but Elias never once gave the order to withdraw. He paced the bridge like a storm, barking orders, eyes locked on the largest enemy cruiser blocking their flanks. "We're not dying in the dark," he said calmly. "We're making them choke on their victory." The bridge crew roared in agreement, their voices hoarse but fierce. The council, safe in their distant golden chambers, watched the live feeds in silence. Some delegates called the humans reckless. Others called them dangerous. But even they could not look away as a single Terran fleet stood against a storm. The Chancellor of the Council leaned forward, his jaw tight. He didn't like what he was seeing. A single act of defiance could inspire more. If humans showed the galaxy that even the weak could be defended, everything the Council built on fear and control would begin to crack. As the hours dragged on, the battlefield turned into a graveyard of metal and fire. The invaders had numbers. The humans had will. They fought until their guns overheated, until their hands were slick with sweat and blood. On the streets, Veskari civilians began helping, carrying ammunition, dragging the wounded, whispering prayers to their ancient gods. It wasn't much, but it meant everything. Humanity had not only fought for them, they had made them believe again. When the invaders' second wave finally faltered, retreating to orbit to regroup, the city stood battered but alive. Scylla, a young Veskari healer, stumbled into the light with tears streaking down her ash-stained cheeks. She looked up at the smoke-filled sky, at the burning Terran ships still holding position above the planet, and whispered, "They stayed." No one else ever had. On the bridge, Elias slumped against the console, exhaustion etched into his face. But his eyes were hard and unbroken. He looked at the holomap, at the enemy fleet pulling back, and knew this was just the beginning. The Council wouldn't save them. The rest of the galaxy wouldn't care. Humanity would stand alone again. And somehow, that didn't scare him. It had always been that way. Below, in the ruins, the Veskari carried the wounded humans on makeshift stretchers, their frail hands shaking but determined. They no longer saw Terrans as strangers. They saw them as the only ones who had answered when no one else did. And somewhere deep inside the invaders' war council, doubt began to spread. If a single Terran fleet could hold this long, what would happen when the rest of humanity heard about this fight? As the night settled over the scorched city, the soldiers leaned against broken walls, breathing hard, their armor cracked, their faces streaked with soot. But they were alive. The Veskari sat beside them in silence, listening to the low hum of Terran engines above. A species that the Council feared for its brutality had become the protectors of the weak. And the galaxy was starting to notice. This was more than a battle. It was the beginning of a legend. A story that would be whispered for generations. Humanity had chosen to fight when everyone else turned away. And they weren't done yet. The ruins of the Veskari capital still smoldered under a bruised sky, and the acrid scent of burnt stone clung to the air like a shadow that refused to lift. Human soldiers moved like ghosts through the shattered streets, their armor scarred, their boots crunching over alien rubble. Terran banners had been raised over the ruins, not as symbols of conquest, but as beacons of stubborn defiance. Everyone knew this was only a pause. The invaders had not given up. They were regrouping. And when they returned, they would bring the full weight of their fury down upon this fragile world. Humanity had walked into a storm without allies. They stood alone between a merciless enemy and a helpless species the galaxy had already buried. Captain Elias Vance stood on the bridge of the Iron Will, staring at the endless black of space where the enemy fleet gathered just beyond sensor range. He could feel it in his bones, a pressure building like a thunderhead before a hurricane. His officers stood around him in silence, their faces pale but unbroken. They knew what was coming. They had seen it before on a dozen different battlefields. When an enemy lost face, they came back not to fight, but to annihilate. "They are waiting for reinforcements," Commander Talbot said softly. Elias didn't answer. He didn't need to. The enemy would return with more ships, more soldiers, more firepower than the Terran fleet could withstand. And yet, no one even considered retreat. Down in the battered city, the Veskari were emerging from their shelters. They were still fragile, still trembling from the terror of near extinction, but they were no longer alone. Terran engineers worked side by side with alien survivors, reinforcing walls, setting up shield generators salvaged from wrecked ships, and turning ruins into makeshift strongholds. Children clung to the legs of human medics, their wide luminous eyes following every movement. Veskari healers tended to wounded Terran soldiers, their delicate hands brushing against rough human skin with a kind of reverent awe. They couldn't understand why humans had come, but their presence was changing everything. Where there had been despair, now there was something else, a small, dangerous ember of hope. The Galactic Council, sitting safely in their gleaming chamber far across the stars, watched the unfolding conflict in silence. Delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats as the human fleet's defiance played across the wide holoscreens. They whispered about treaties, about neutrality, about balance. But beneath their words was fear. Humanity had always been unpredictable. They didn't follow council protocol. They didn't wait for permission. And when they fought, they didn't stop. The Chancellor slammed his claw against the desk. If they win, he growled, every species in this galaxy will see they don't need us. They will see the Council's silence for what it is, cowardice. The invaders returned in the dead of night. Their ships rose from the far side of the system like black sharks moving through deep water, silent, endless, unstoppable. Warning alarms blared through the iron will, bathing the bridge in crimson light. They are here, Talbot said. Elias stood straighter, his voice calm. Then let's remind them why humans don't run. The first wave hit like a tidal surge. Enemy fighters screamed through the atmosphere, black shapes cutting through ash and wind. Anti-air cannons hidden in the ruins opened fire, turning the skies into a storm of tracers. Explosions lit the night, and for a heartbeat, the city itself seemed to hold its breath. Human infantry braced at the barricades, fingers on triggers, their faces illuminated by the orange glow of distant fires. Enemy mechs thundered down the cracked avenues. Human soldiers answered with fury. Veskari civilians watched from underground bunkers, listening to the earth rumble with war. The Council had told them for years that humanity was dangerous, savage, a race of predators best kept on a leash. But what they saw above proved something else. The humans were dangerous, yes, but not to the helpless. They were dangerous to those who preyed upon the helpless. Terran soldiers fought like creatures who had nothing to lose. Their lines bent but didn't break. When an enemy walker smashed through the eastern wall, human rocket teams swarmed it from the flanks, planting explosives with brutal precision. When drones rained plasma from above, snipers on the rooftops answered with cold, steady fire. In orbit, the Terran fleet charged headfirst into the enemy blockade. They didn't have the numbers, but numbers meant little to a species that had clawed its way through its own dark history. Terran ships moved in chaotic, unpredictable formations, striking and retreating like wolves harassing a bear. Enemy formations began to stutter. Their command ships had prepared for a disciplined defense. Instead, they faced madness wrapped in steel. On the ground, Scylla, a young Veskari who had lost everything, stood in the doorway of an underground shelter. She had never seen war like this. Her people had always run when the powerful came. But the humans did not run. She watched a wounded Terran soldier, his leg torn and bleeding, drag himself to his weapon and fire again with a snarl. She watched a group of engineers refuse to leave their post, manually overriding a damaged shield generator with sparks burning their faces. She watched strangers fight for her people as if they were defending their own home. Something inside her chest began to ache, not with fear, but with the dangerous, fragile beginning of belief. Hours turned into a blur of fire and steel. Both sides bled, but only one side was fighting for something more than survival. When the invaders' second wave faltered, the humans surged forward. The streets ran red, and the enemy lines began to fracture. Their ships had always counted on the galaxy's apathy. They had never counted on humanity's rage. The Council's silent chamber echoed with whispered disbelief as data feeds came in. Terran ships holding, enemy fleets retreating. No one said it aloud, but the meaning was clear. If a single human fleet could defy this armada, what else could they do? When the battle finally subsided, the ruined city still stood. It wasn't whole. It wasn't clean. But it was still there. Smoke drifted through shattered archways as the sun rose, spilling pale gold light over soldiers slumped in the rubble, their armor blackened and their hands still clenched around their weapons. Veskari civilians crept out of their shelters in stunned silence. A child ran forward and touched the Terran flag hanging crooked over a barricade, its edges torn but still standing. In that moment, something changed, not just for the Veskari, but for the galaxy. Word of the battle spread fast. Across distant colonies and neutral worlds, species that had long cowered under the Council's silent rule began to whisper. If humanity would stand for strangers, maybe they could stand too. If the Council wouldn't protect the weak, maybe someone else could. The Chancellor could already feel his grip on power slipping, thread by thread. Elias Vance stood on the bridge of the Iron Will with smoke still curling from the damaged panels. He stared at the battlefield below, at the broken world that still lived, and he knew the war was only beginning. But it wasn't just humanity fighting now. It was something far bigger, a truth too dangerous for the Council to contain. For the first time in generations, the galaxy had seen what happened when humans answered a cry for help. And it would never forget. The night after the second battle was quiet, but it wasn't the kind of silence that brought peace. It was the silence of exhaustion, the kind that settles after a storm has broken everything and left the survivors to stare at the wreckage. Fires burned in the ruins, their light flickering against shattered towers. The once beautiful capital of the Veskari was now nothing more than twisted metal and cracked stone, but it was still standing. That alone was a miracle. Across the broken city, Terran soldiers sat slumped against rubble, their armor cracked and streaked with soot, their eyes hollow but alive. Above them, the battered silhouette of the Iron Will floated in low orbit, her hull scarred by railfire but still holding position like a guardian refusing to fall. The Veskari had no words for what they were witnessing. No one had ever stood for them like this. No one had ever bled for their people. In the shelters below, whispers traveled from one survivor to the next. They spoke of the humans with rough, reverent voices. They spoke of soldiers who didn't run, of ships that faced fleets 100 times their size, of voices shouting orders with fire instead of fear. They had grown up being told that the galaxy belonged to the powerful, that weak races had no place in wars between giants. But the Terrans were rewriting that story with every drop of blood they spilled on Veskari soil. On the bridge of the Iron Will, Captain Elias Vance stared at the tactical map. Red enemy signatures were still out there, floating beyond sensor range. The invaders hadn't left. They were regrouping. Everyone on the bridge knew what that meant. They wouldn't just attack again. They'd come with everything. Commander Talbot leaned against the console, his voice low and steady despite the fatigue in his face. They'll bring the entire sector fleet next time, he said. They want to bury this planet so deep no one remembers it existed. Elias nodded slowly, his hands tightening on the rail. Then we'll make sure they remember. Down in the ruins, Sergeant Nia Monroe walked through what was left of the East Quarter. Her unit had been reduced to half strength, but their eyes were sharp, their movements precise. She stopped to help an injured Veskari healer to their feet. The alien's hands trembled as they gripped her arm. Why? The healer whispered in their soft, melodic language. Why are you still here? Monroe didn't have a speech prepared. She wasn't fighting for medals or politics. She just looked at the alien and said quietly, because someone has to be. The healer's eyes filled with tears. In their world, no one ever said words like that. In the Council's glittering chamber, thousands of light-years away, chaos spread like cracks in glass. The footage of the human stand had reached every corner of the galaxy. Delegates shouted over each other, some demanding that humanity be restrained, others fearing that their own people might start asking questions. Why should they follow a council that would let the weak burn? Why should they stay silent when the humans had proven it was possible to fight back? The Chancellor slammed a clawed hand against the table, silencing the chamber. They are a threat, he snarled. Not because they fight. Because they inspire. Back on the planet, Terran engineers and Veskari survivors worked through the night, turning ruins into defenses. They welded metal beams, reinforced broken walls, and converted collapsed buildings into bunkers. The humans didn't treat the Veskari like victims. They treated them like allies. Even the smallest child who could carry a box of supplies was given a task. It wasn't a gesture of pity. It was how humanity fought, together. The aliens had never experienced anything like it. They had always been sheltered, waiting for someone stronger to decide their fate. But standing beside the Terrans, something inside them shifted. As dawn approached, the enemy revealed their next move. From beyond the edge of the system, massive energy spikes appeared on scanners. It wasn't just a strike force this time. It was an armada. Dozens of warships, their hulls black and gleaming like the skin of some monstrous beast, moved toward the planet in silent formation. The sight made the bridge of the Iron Will go still. Even Elias felt a flicker of unease in his chest. But fear was not new to humans. They had lived with it, fought through it, turned it into something sharp. "They are bringing everything they have," Talbot whispered. Elias's voice was cold steel. "Good. So are we." The fleet sent a transmission to Earth and every human colony in range. It wasn't a plea for help. It was a simple message. Elias's voice carried through the void. "They're coming to erase an entire species because no one else cared. If we stand here, we stand for every world the Council would abandon next. If you can fight, come." Across human space, fleets stirred. Old warships were pulled out of orbit. Colony defense squadrons scrambled. Civilian pilots answered the call. Humanity didn't have a single unified empire, but they didn't need one. They had something stronger, a shared rage for every time they had watched the galaxy turn its back on the weak. And one by one, they jumped to the Veskari system. Scylla, the young Veskari healer who had lost her family in the first attacks, stood outside a bunker watching human ships streak across the morning sky like silver comets. She had lived through terror so deep it left scars on her soul. But now, for the first time, she felt something else, a rising pressure in her chest that made it hard to breathe. It was hope, but heavier, sharper. It wasn't the quiet kind that whispered things might be okay. It was the dangerous kind that screamed they would fight back. The invaders arrived at noon. Their armada filled the horizon, black ships cutting through the light like blades. The air itself seemed to tremble. The Veskari dropped to their knees, old instincts telling them to hide. The humans raised their weapons and lifted their heads. In orbit, Terran reinforcements poured in from jump points like a tide of silver and iron. Thousands of ships now hung between the enemy and the burning world. On the bridge of the Iron Will, Elias looked at the wall of enemy ships and felt the weight of everything pressing on his chest. This wasn't just about one world anymore. This was a line in the sand. "All batteries," he ordered quietly. "Fire when ready." The sky exploded. Missiles streaked like burning stars. Railgun rounds roared through the void. The Black Armada answered with a storm of plasma. In the cities below, the ground shook as ships fell from orbit like burning meteors. The invaders had expected a small resistance, a defiant last gasp. What they found was a human war machine standing shoulder to shoulder with a people the galaxy had abandoned. The Council's feeds showed the battle unfolding in real time. Billions watched as humanity, once dismissed as dangerous savages, stood between an empire and its prey. And as the enemy pressed harder, the humans pressed back harder still. Every loss only fueled them. Every fallen ship lit another fire. This was what humanity was. Not rulers. Not conquerors. Just a species that refused to let cruelty win without a fight. And as the first wave of the enemy fleet began to falter under the Terran assault, something extraordinary happened. Veskari ships, small, outdated, barely functional, lifted off from hidden hangars. Pilots who had spent their lives avoiding war now joined the humans. They weren't skilled. Their ships were weak. But they chose to fight. The humans cheered when they saw them rise, their voices shaking the comm channels with pride. "Welcome to the line," Monroe whispered into her MIC. The battle raged as the sun began to set, the sky a canvas of fire and smoke. Humanity and the Veskari stood side by side, and for the first time in history, the invaders realized they were not just facing a fleet. They were facing a force that didn't know how to kneel. The Council's golden chamber fell silent as one enemy dreadnought after another fell in flames. This was no longer just a rescue. It was a rebellion. Elias watched from the bridge, his eyes burning with exhaustion and fury. "They'll remember this day," Talbot said quietly. Elias nodded once. "Good," he whispered. "They should." And out there, across the stars, oppressed species who had lived under fear for centuries leaned a little closer to their screens, hearts pounding, realizing something dangerous and beautiful. Humanity had drawn a line in the sand, not for themselves, but for someone else. And the galaxy would never be the same again. The battle at the edge of the Viscari world tore across the sky like the wrath of gods. Black enemy ships blotted out the sun, their weapons thundering against Terran shields as if trying to burn the will of humanity out of existence. The ground below trembled with every impact. The horizon burned orange where debris rained down like falling stars. The air was thick with smoke, dust, and the sharp scent of metal and ash. It wasn't a clean war. It wasn't noble. It was brutal, loud, and merciless. Yet, amid that storm, humans stood their ground with the kind of stubborn fury only they possessed. On the bridge of the Iron Will, Captain Elias Vance's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Lock their forward batteries. I want that cruiser dead." His crew moved with the precision of people who had faced the impossible before. The flagship's railguns charged, their hum rising like the growl of a beast. Then, with a single command, fire streaked across the void. The enemy cruiser split in two, its black hull burning as it spiraled down toward the atmosphere like a dying star. Cheers erupted across Terran comms, raw and fierce. But Elias didn't celebrate. He knew this was far from over. The enemy wasn't retreating. If anything, their fury grew. Entire wings of their assault craft broke from formation and dove straight toward the Terran defensive line. The Iron Will shuddered as multiple impacts struck its shields. Down below, the city groaned as artillery fire ripped through abandoned towers and shattered streets. Sergeant Monroe's squad crouched behind broken walls, eyes locked on the incoming drop pods that screamed through the clouds like burning meteors. "They're coming in hard," someone shouted over comms. "Then we meet them harder," Monroe growled back, cocking her rifle. The Viscari civilians who had once hidden underground were no longer just waiting to be saved. They worked alongside Terran engineers, hauling ammunition, patching supply lines, and helping the wounded. Viscari mechanics, long forced to build for invaders, now used their skills to repair Terran weapons and armor. Their hands shook at first, but soon, they moved with purpose. Above them, small Viscari ships, fragile and outdated, joined the human formation. Their flight patterns were messy, clumsy compared to trained human pilots, but they were in the fight. And that changed everything. When the enemy's second wave slammed into the defenders, the city shook to its foundations. Drop pods burst open like claws cracking, releasing armored enemy infantry that advanced through fire and debris. Monroe's squad opened up with everything they had. Terran rifles roared in sharp bursts, cutting through the smoke. Explosions ripped down the streets as anti-armor charges detonated beneath enemy mechs. The fight turned close, desperate, personal. In the ruins of a broken tower, a Viscari healer crouched next to a fallen human soldier, pressing trembling hands against a bleeding wound. The soldier gritted his teeth and whispered hoarsely, "Don't stop. You got this." No one had ever told the Viscari they were strong. But now, in the middle of this storm, they believed it. Up in orbit, the battle had turned into a nightmare of steel and fire. Terran reinforcements poured in from colony space. Old warships, some barely holding together, joined the line, filling the void with guns. The enemy expected clean formations, disciplined strategies. Instead, they faced something they could not predict. Human ships attacked like wolves, tearing through weak points, striking from angles no manual could account for. Viscari fighters followed, clumsy at first but growing bolder with every pass. One small alien ship slammed straight into an enemy frigate, igniting its fuel lines. The explosion sent shockwaves through the enemy ranks. The Galactic Council watched it all from their shining chamber far across the stars. Delegates whispered furiously, faces pale and uncertain. For centuries, the Council had ruled by standing apart, letting the strong consume the weak while pretending their hands were clean. But the humans were undoing that illusion in real time. Entire populations were tuning into the battlefeeds. What they saw wasn't just war. They saw a choice. They saw one species stand when no one else would. They saw the weak rise beside them. And for the first time in generations, they wondered why they hadn't done the same. The enemy command tried to break the defenders with overwhelming force. They targeted the Iron Will directly, concentrating fire from 5 capital ships. The shields screamed, the hull groaned. "We're losing integrity." Talbot shouted. Elias stared at the burning display and whispered, "Not yet." The Iron Will's engines flared, pushing the ship forward into the teeth of the enemy formation. It was suicide on paper. But humans had never been good at following the kind of rules the galaxy expected. The flagship rammed into one of the enemy vessels, railguns tearing through its belly at point-blank range. Both ships vanished into an explosion so bright it lit up the entire battlefield. For a moment, silence rippled through the comm channels. Then Monroe's voice broke through, ragged and burning with defiance. "The captain gave us a hole. Push through." Terran and Viscari ships surged into the gap like a flood bursting through a broken dam. The enemy formation wavered for the first time. They had expected fear. They got fury instead. Down on the ground, the invader infantry began to falter. For every human that fell, 2 more stepped into the fight. The Viscari, once voiceless victims, picked up scavenged weapons and fired alongside their defenders. A young Viscari boy, no older than 15, helped drag ammunition crates to Monroe's squad. No one told him to. He just did. The humans didn't treat him like a liability. They nodded in respect. And that single nod meant more to him than any speech ever could. When the enemy's flagship broke apart in orbit, the entire battlefield seemed to freeze for a heartbeat. Flames rolled across the sky like thunderclouds. The invaders, who had believed they were unstoppable, stared at the sight of their greatest ship dying in fire. And slowly, like a chain reaction, their confidence began to fracture. Some ships peeled away. Some soldiers hesitated. And humans never missed a hesitation. "Push!" Monroe bellowed, her voice echoing through the comms. Terran soldiers surged forward, kicking down the last enemy barricades. Viscari fighters dove overhead, launching improvised missiles. For the first time since the war began, the invaders were retreating, not regrouping, not repositioning. Retreating. In the council chamber, the Chancellor slammed his clawed hand on the table. "If they win this, everything changes," he hissed. But the whispers around him had changed too. Some delegates were no longer looking at him. They were looking at the human feed with quiet, dangerous awe. When the last enemy dropship fled into the upper atmosphere, the city erupted in sound, not from guns, but from breath. Viscari survivors poured out of bunkers, crying, cheering, some falling to their knees. Terran soldiers leaned against walls, too tired to stand, their faces blackened by smoke but their eyes alive. Monroe stood on a cracked rooftop, looking out over the burning horizon. The enemy wasn't gone, not yet. But for the first time, they'd tasted fear. Up in orbit, the wreckage of the Iron Will floated like a scar across the stars. She was broken but not destroyed. Emergency beacons pulsed, and her crew worked to bring her back online. She had done what no one thought possible. She had held the line. Elias Vance was pulled from the wreckage barely breathing, his uniform scorched, his hands burned raw. When he opened his eyes in the med bay, the first thing he heard was not human voices, but Viscari singing. It was a soft, trembling song, old and ancient, a song of mourning and gratitude. They sang it for their lost, but they also sang it for the humans who had stood when no one else would. Word of the victory spread across the stars like a tidal wave. Planets under council rule whispered in the dark. Colonies long forgotten began to stir. No one had ever stood up to the council's fear and the invaders' strength at once. But humanity had. And that changed everything. As night fell, Monroe walked through the quiet streets, past Viscari children holding broken Terran flags like treasures. She looked up at the sky, at the wrecked ships silhouetted against the stars, and she understood something deep and simple. This war wasn't about power anymore. It was about a spark. Humanity had lit it here, on a world no one cared about. And now, that spark was spreading to the rest of the galaxy. And far away, in the darkness beyond the frontier, other oppressed species watched and whispered. If the Terrans could stand for the Veskari, maybe they could stand too. And that whisper, more than any weapon, was the one thing the Council could not control. The war wasn't over. It was only beginning. The smoke still hung over the ruined city like a shroud, drifting lazily across the pale gray sky. The Veskari capital was quiet, not the silence of death, but the kind that follows after thunder has torn the world apart. Burned towers leaned at broken angles. Ash drifted like slow snow over cracked streets. The air reeked of fire, ozone, and the bitter aftertaste of war. Terran soldiers stood scattered through the ruins, exhausted beyond measure. They had held the line. Against everything, they had held. But they all knew this was not the end. It was only the beginning of something far larger. Captain Elias Vance lay in the medbay of the Iron Will, his body battered and half-wrapped in bandages, the hum of life support machines filling the silence. He should have been dead, but he wasn't. His eyes opened slowly to the soft sound of voices, not human, but Veskari. Survivors had gathered outside the bay, singing their ancient song of healing and remembrance. It was the same song they had sung for their dead for centuries. But this time, it was not only a dirge. It was a promise. He turned his head slightly and saw the faces of two Veskari children peeking through the doorway. Their wide, luminous eyes were filled with something fragile and fierce at the same time. Hope. Beyond the ship, the battlefield was a graveyard. The enemy's flagship lay broken in orbit, its twisted metal bleeding fire into the void. Shattered fragments of their armada drifted silently through the black, reflecting the light of distant suns like a floating storm of knives. But what struck the galaxy wasn't just the wreckage. It was the fact that the Terrans had done the impossible. A single human fleet, with outdated ships and borrowed time, had stood against a full invasion force and won. And they had not fought for themselves. They had fought for a people the rest of the galaxy had already abandoned. The Galactic Council chamber was in uproar. Holofeeds of the battle played again and again on massive floating displays. Delegates argued, shouted, whispered in tight clusters. The Chancellor slammed his clawed hand on the polished table, the sound echoing through the chamber. "This is a threat," he snarled. "Humanity is not simply fighting wars. They are rewriting the order of the galaxy." But even as he spoke, he could see it in their eyes. The other delegates were no longer looking at him with fear. They were looking at the humans. And some of them were thinking dangerous thoughts. Word of the victory spread like wildfire through systems the Council had long controlled. On forgotten colony worlds and in underground networks, whispers turned into conversations. Conversations turned into messages. Oppressed species who had lived their lives under the Council's quiet rule now looked up at the stars and saw something they had never seen before. Someone had stood up. Someone had shown that the Council wasn't invincible. The spark that had been lit on a forgotten world was now racing through the dark like a streak of flame. Back on the planet, the Veskari were rebuilding. It wasn't much, a wall repaired here, a generator rewired there, but it was theirs. Where once there had only been despair, now their hands worked with quiet determination. Human engineers worked alongside them, laughing through their exhaustion, teaching them how to fortify their cities. Children followed Terran soldiers through the streets like shadows, wide-eyed and curious. The old Veskari elders, who had believed the galaxy was something too vast and cruel to resist, now sat together in the warm light of the fires, whispering, "The humans came." Scylla, the young Veskari healer who had once hidden in the dark tunnels, now walked openly through the streets. Her people bowed their heads slightly when she passed, not because of who she was, but because she had been there when everything changed. She found Monroe's squad sitting on the crumbled steps of an old government building, their armor scorched and dented. Monroe herself leaned back against a cracked pillar, her hands still black with grease from patching weapons. When she saw Scylla, she smiled faintly, tired but warm. "You made it," Monroe said. Scylla nodded slowly. We all did. Because you stayed. There was no speech. No grand announcement. Just the quiet weight of what they had done. But the enemy hadn't vanished. Across the sector, the remnants of their fleet regrouped. They were angry. Humiliated. For centuries they had crushed weaker civilizations without consequence. But humanity had done more than just fight them. They had shattered their image of inevitability. And humiliation like that never went unanswered. The next war was coming. Everyone knew it. Elias returned to the Bridge of the Iron Will 2 days later, still limping but standing tall. The ship's hull was scarred and twisted, entire decks sealed off, but she was alive. Like the humans who crewed her, she refused to die. As Elias looked out at the drifting wreckage of the enemy fleet, Talbot stepped forward with a grim smile. "You should be in bed," he muttered. Elias ignored him. "The Council's silence is already breaking," he said quietly. "They can't ignore what happened here. No one can." Across the galaxy, something strange began to happen. Viscari messages were picked up by other oppressed races. They spoke of the night humanity came, of the fire in their ships, of the soldiers who fought like they had nothing left to lose. These weren't just stories. They were invitations. Rebellion didn't start with declarations. It started with whispers. And those whispers were growing louder every day. The enemy command council met in the dark. Their leader, cloaked in shadows, pounded his fist on the table as reports came in. "They made us bleed," he hissed. "A single human fleet." His advisors tried to offer excuses. Terrain, surprise, interference, but he silenced them. "We cannot let them become a symbol," he growled. "Symbols are harder to destroy than ships." But even he knew that something had changed. Crushing humanity would not erase what they had done. It would only make them martyrs. On the ground, Scylla stood on a balcony overlooking the city. It was still ruined. Smoke still rose from the far edges. But the fires were no longer only the fires of war. They were the fires of rebuilding. Terran and Viscari flags hung side by side from the cracked towers. Down in the streets, soldiers and civilians worked as one. She turned her face to the night sky where the Iron Will floated like a scarred guardian above their world. She felt something unfamiliar but powerful burning in her chest. It wasn't fear anymore. It was resolve. Elias joined her, his posture stiff but unbroken. "You should be resting," she said softly. He gave a rough, tired laugh. "I'll rest when the galaxy does." For a moment, they stood in silence, listening to the faint sounds of hammers and engines echoing through the ruins. "They'll come again," she said. Elias nodded slowly. "Yes. And next time, we won't be standing alone." He was right. Messages were already coming in from other worlds. Small, hesitant at first, offers of ships, medical aid, safe harbors. Not from the Council. From the forgotten. The ignored. The ones who had spent lifetimes looking over their shoulders. Humanity hadn't just saved the Viscari. They had given the galaxy something the Council had spent centuries crushing. Belief. And far away, deep in the void, entire fleets began to shift course. Colonies once silent began to stir. The galaxy didn't change in a day. Revolutions didn't explode. They caught fire slowly. But the match had been struck here, on a world no one cared about, defended by a fleet no one thought could win. As the first light of dawn touched the broken towers, Monroe walked through the city streets with her rifle slung loosely at her side. She passed Viscari children playing among Terran supply crates, laughing for the first time in months. She passed human engineers and alien builders side by side, arguing over blueprints. She saw a people who had decided to live, not just survive. The war was far from over. The enemy would return. The Council would fight to maintain control. But humanity had proven a truth the galaxy would not forget. Even when no one else comes, they will. And now, they weren't just fighting for themselves. They were fighting for everyone who had ever been abandoned. Up above, the battered Iron Will turned slowly against the light of the rising sun, her scarred hull shining faintly. The galaxy was watching. The Council was afraid. The enemy was regrouping. And humanity was ready. This was no longer about one species saving another. It was about an entire galaxy learning what happens when humans stand between darkness and the forgotten. And this time, they would not stand alone.